The air inside Soul and Vine was thick with the scent of slow-smoked brisket and expensive cologne. It was the kind of place where the mahogany floors shone like glass, and the jazz music played just low enough to make you feel like you were part of an elite secret. I had built this sanctuary to celebrate our culture, a five-star fusion of traditional soul food and high-end fine dining. But tonight, as I stepped through the heavy oak doors, I did not look like the owner of a multi-million-dollar establishment. I looked like the help. I was 45 years old, and my hands were still stained with the dark, rich soil from my organic mushroom farm. I was wearing my old gardening boots, the ones with the worn-out soles, and a pair of faded jeans that had seen better days. I had rushed straight from the harvest to meet my family, and I knew I carried the honest scent of the earth on my skin. As I walked past the velvet curtains, the hostess started to move toward me with a look of concern, but I gave her a subtle nod. She recognized me instantly and stepped back, allowing me to proceed to the large circular table in the center of the room. My father, Otis Washington, sat there like a king on a throne. He was a deacon at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, a man who could quote scripture until the sun went down, but often forgot the part about loving your neighbor. He was wearing his best Sunday suit on a Tuesday night, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. Next to him was my sister Vanessa, who was busy adjusting her designer glasses and checking her reflection in a gold-plated mirror. And then there was Terrence DeBrow, my brother-in-law. Terrence was the kind of man who wore three-piece suits even to a backyard barbecue just to make sure everyone knew he had money. The moment I pulled out the heavy chair, the atmosphere at the table shifted from celebration to disgust. My father did not even look me in the eye. He just stared at my muddy boots as if they were a personal insult to his dignity. Vanessa made a theatrical show of waving a hand in front of her nose, her diamond rings sparkling under the chandeliers. She told me that I smelled like a compost heap and asked if I had forgotten how to use a shower. Terrence just smirked, leaning back in his chair with a look of pure arrogance. He told me that they had a dress code for a reason and suggested that I should have used the service entrance meant for the delivery drivers. I sat down anyway, my back straight and my expression calm. I had learned a long time ago that their words only had power if I chose to feel the sting. Terrence didn't wait for the menus to arrive before he started bragging. He snapped his fingers for the waiter, a young man named Marcus, who I had hired personally last year. Terrence demanded the finest bottle in the cellar, specifically the Legacy Red. He told the table that a bottle like that cost $5,000 and that someone like me probably could not even pronounce the name of the grape. He went on and on about his latest business deal, claiming that he was about to merge his firm with a massive global conglomerate. He promised my father that once the deal closed, he would buy him a new luxury car and move Vanessa into a mansion in the hills. He spoke about the future as if he already owned it, never realizing that the very wine he was pouring into his glass came from the vineyard I had saved from bankruptcy 3 years ago. They sat there sipping my hard work, enjoying the fruits of my labor, while simultaneously treating me like the dirt under their fingernails. It was a masterpiece of irony, and I watched it all unfold with a quiet, steady fire burning in my chest. The transition from the quiet rows of my organic mushroom farm to the vibrant pulse of downtown was always jarring, but tonight felt especially heavy. I could still feel the damp residue of the earth beneath my fingernails as I stepped out of my old pickup truck. I looked down at my reflection in the polished glass of the restaurant entrance and saw a woman who looked like she had spent 14 hours battling the elements. My work boots were encrusted with thick layers of Georgia clay, and my denim jeans were faded to a ghostly blue at the knees. I was 45 years old, and I had long ago traded the vanity of high heels for the practicality of the soil. As the heavy brass handles of Soul and Vine gave way, the world of labor vanished and was replaced by a symphony of luxury. The air was cool and carried the sophisticated notes of aged bourbon and slow-roasted garlic. A live jazz quartet was playing a smooth rendition of an old Duke Ellington classic in the corner, the bass notes thumping like a heartbeat against the marble floors. Everything about this place shouted excellence. The walls were adorned with black and white portraits of jazz legends, and the crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain from the coffered ceilings. It was a palace built to honor the resilience and beauty of our people, and it was my proudest achievement. However, as I moved toward the dining area, I was a jagged line in a perfect painting. I watched the other patrons out of the corner of my eye. There were couples in silk dresses and tailored suits, their laughter tinkling like the fine china on their tables. I saw the way their eyes lingered on my disheveled hair and the smudge of dirt on my cheek. To them, I was a mistake, or perhaps a drifter who had lost her way. They could not see the strategic mind behind the messy exterior. They did not know that the very floor they walked on was maintained by my payroll, or that the menu they studied was a collection of my grandmother's secret recipes elevated to fine art. The hostess, a bright young woman named Elena, who I had hired just 6 months ago, began to walk toward me with a practiced mask of professional concern. I saw her eyes take in my stained clothes and my weary posture. For a split second, I saw her prepare to politely redirect me to the exit. But then our eyes locked. She saw the steady, unwavering gaze of the woman who signed her paychecks every 2 weeks. Recognition hit her like a physical blow, and her posture shifted instantly from defense to deep respect. She started to bow her head, but I gave her a sharp, nearly invisible shake of my head. I did not want a grand entrance. I wanted to see the truth of my family without the filter of my fortune. I walked toward the center of the room where the light was brightest. My father, Otis, was already laughing at something Terrence had said, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who thought he was the most important person in the room. He looked up as I approached, and the laughter died in his throat. The warmth left his eyes replaced by a cold, sharp blade of embarrassment. He looked at my boots, and then looked around the room to see if anyone he knew was watching this disaster. Vanessa stopped mid-sentence, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. The contrast was complete. I was the reality of the earth standing in a room full of people, pretending they had never touched it. The air at the table was cold enough to freeze the spirit of a lesser woman. My father, Otis Washington, sat there with his hands folded, as if he were preparing to lead a prayer meeting, but there was no holiness in the way he looked at me. As a senior deacon at the First Baptist Church, he spent every Sunday morning preaching about the dignity of the soul and the importance of charity. However, the moment he saw his own flesh and blood sitting in a 5-star restaurant with dirt on her boots, all that theology vanished. He looked at me with a profound sense of loathing, his eyes darting nervously toward the nearby tables. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was terrified that Sister Miller or Brother Johnson from the choir would see me and realize that the great Otis Washington had a daughter who looked like a common field hand. To him, my hard work was not a source of pride. It was a stain on the shiny reputation he had spent 70 years building. To my left, my sister Vanessa was barely present in the moment, her soul consumed by the glowing screen of her phone and the reflection in her compact mirror. She was draped in enough designer logos to fund a small school. A massive gold belt buckle shaped like 2 intertwined letters sat heavy on her waist, and her ears were weighed down by silver hoops that cost more than a used car. She stopped long enough to apply a fresh layer of deep red lipstick, her movements sharp and performative. She leaned away from me as if I were a plague victim waving a manicured hand in the air with a look of theatrical pain. She told the table that I smelled exactly like a horse stable after a long rain. She laughed a high, jagged sound and asked if the organic farm had finally replaced my brain with compost. Vanessa had always equated value with the price tag on a dress, and since my clothes looked free, she treated me like I was worthless. Then there was Terrence DeBrow, the man who had married into our family, and brought with him a level of arrogance that was almost suffocating. Terrence worked in high-stakes finance, or so he claimed, and he dressed like a man who was constantly trying to prove he belonged in the room. His navy blue suit was so shiny it looked metallic, and his silk tie was knotted with a precision that felt aggressive. He did not even bother to hide his contempt. He leaned back in his velvet chair, swirling a glass of water as if it were top-shelf scotch, and let out a dry, condescending chuckle. He told me that there was an alleyway behind the kitchen where the delivery drivers dropped off the crates of lettuce. He suggested that I would feel much more at home out there with the other laborers. Terrence loved the power of money, but he lacked the wisdom to recognize the woman who actually controlled the flow of it. He saw a gardener, while I saw a man who was one bad investment away from losing everything he pretended to be. The three of them sat there in their bubbles of vanity, united by their shared embarrassment of me. They spoke about me as if I were a piece of furniture that did not match the decor of the room. I listened to their insults, each one sharper than the last, and I felt the familiar weight of their judgment. But beneath that weight, there was a growing sense of clarity. I saw them for who they truly were, hollow vessels chasing the wind, while I was the one who owned the very air they were breathing. Terrence leaned forward, his elbows resting on the white linen cloth with a proprietary air that made my skin crawl. He snapped his fingers again, summoning a waiter with the casual disrespect of a man who viewed other human beings as mere tools for his comfort. When the waiter arrived, Terrence did not even look at the menu. Instead, he demanded the Legacy Red, a bottle that sat at the very top of our wine list. He made sure to announce to the entire table, and likely the two tables closest to us, that this specific bottle cost $5,000. He claimed that the soil, the climate, and the very hands that picked the grapes were of a pedigree that common people could never understand. He looked directly at me when he said the word common, his eyes gleaming with a cruel sort of triumph. He poured a glass for my father and Vanessa, letting the deep crimson liquid swirl against the crystal as he began his grand performance. He began to talk about his firm sterling capital with a fervor that bordered on religious. Terrence claimed that he was in the final stages of a massive merger with a global powerhouse known as KR Enterprises. He told my father that this deal would change the trajectory of the entire Washington family. He spoke about millions of dollars as if they were pocket change, and promised that by this time next year, Vanessa would never have to set foot in a grocery store again. He promised my father a new wing for the church, named after the Washington family, to ensure his legacy was etched in stone. He spoke with a rapid, frantic energy, painting a picture of a future filled with private jets and summer homes. He told us that we were finally moving into the upper stratosphere of society, leaving the dirt and the struggle behind for good. As he talked, he took a deep theatrical sip of the wine. He closed his eyes and hummed in approval, praising the complexity and the expensive finish of the vintage. He told my father that you could literally taste the money in every drop. It was a struggle to keep my face neutral as I watched him. Terrence was acting as if he were the king of the world, unaware that the very wine he was praising was a product of my own vision. He did not know that I had spent 3 years perfecting that specific blend on my farm, or that the global powerhouse he was so desperate to join was a company that I owned in its entirety. He was selling his soul to buy a seat at a table that I had built with my own 2 hands. Vanessa clapped her hands in delight, already talking about the gala dresses she would buy and the influencers she would finally outshine. My father nodded with a solemn, greedy approval, his eyes fixed on the imaginary church wing Terrence was building in the air. They were all so intoxicated by the promise of easy wealth that they failed to notice the reality sitting right in front of them. Terrence laughed a loud and hollow sound and raised his glass in a toast to success and to the end of mediocrity. He looked at my dusty clothes one last time and told me that once the deal was done, he might find a small position for me in the filing room so I could finally learn what real work looked like. I just picked up my water glass and took a slow, quiet sip, knowing that the higher he built his mountain of lies, the further he would have to fall. I sat there in the heavy silence that exists beneath the roar of a crowded room, watching them with a clarity that felt like cold water. It was a strange and bitter sensation to be invisible in a place that I owned, surrounded by people who shared my blood, but possessed none of my heart. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the rough texture of the calluses on my palms. The permanent reminders of the years I had spent rebuilding what they had all dismissed as a failure. They had no idea that the Legacy Red swirling in their glasses was more than just a luxury item. That wine was a resurrection. I had bought that vineyard 3 years ago when it was nothing but dried vines and broken dreams, and I had worked alongside the harvesters until my back felt like it would snap. I had tasted every grape and tested every soil sample, pouring my very soul into those bottles. Watching Terrence sip that wine while insulting my existence was a special kind of agony. He spoke about the complexity of the finish and the richness of the oak, using the vocabulary of a connoisseur to hide the heart of a thief. He was literally consuming my sweat and my tears, feeding his ego with the labor of my hands, all while suggesting that I was a parasite on the family name. The irony was a jagged pill that I forced myself to swallow without a flinch. I looked at my father, the man who had taught me about the dignity of work in the church, but refused to see the dignity in mine. He praised Terrence for his vision and his wealth, unaware that the chair he sat upon and the very air he breathed in this establishment were provided by the daughter he was currently trying to ignore. A profound sense of isolation settled over me, but it was not the kind that made me feel weak. It was the isolation of a mountain peak. I realized in that moment that they did not hate me for being poor. They hated me because I did not fit the narrow, shiny boxes they had built for themselves. They needed me to be the failure so they could feel like successes. Every insult Vanessa hurled and every condescending laugh Terrence let out was a brick in a wall they were building to keep the truth away. They were drinking my life force and spitting in my face, convinced that their designer labels made them superior to the woman who provided the very stage they were performing on. I felt a sudden sharp urge to stand up and scream the truth, to watch the wine turn to ash in their mouths as they realized who I really was. I wanted to see the color drain from Vanessa's face and the arrogance vanish from Terrence's eyes, but I stayed still. I knew that the harvest of justice required patience, just like the grapes in my fields. The truth was a harvest that was almost ready, and when it finally arrived, it would be far more potent than any wine. I took a slow breath, letting the jazz music ground me, and I committed their faces to memory. I would remember this moment of ultimate disrespect. I would remember the way they toasted to a future that was already in my hands. They were guests in a world I had built, and very soon the bill for their cruelty was going to be due. The air at our table was thick with the scent of vanity and the sharp tang of expensive grapes. Vanessa was completely lost in her digital world, tilting her head at precise angles to catch the golden light of the chandeliers. She was holding the bottle of Legacy Red as if it were a trophy, her long manicured nails tapping against the glass while she adjusted her phone for the perfect shot. She wanted her followers to see the $5,000 price tag, to feel the envy of a life she could barely afford. Terrence was leaning back, puffing out his chest, and continuing his lecture on global markets, oblivious to the fact that Vanessa was losing her grip on the heavy bottle. In an instant, the carefully constructed elegance of the evening shattered. Vanessa reached for her crystal glass to include it in the frame, but her silk sleeve caught the edge of the base. Time seemed to slow down as the deep crimson liquid erupted from the glass, arching through the air like a burst of dark lightning. It landed with a heavy, wet thud directly onto the center of Terrence's pristine white designer shirt. The stains spread rapidly, turning the crisp cotton into a bloody, sodden mess that ruined his $1,000 silk tie and soaked through to his skin. Terrence let out a strangled yelp, jumping up so quickly that his heavy chair scraped harshly against the marble floor, drawing the attention of every patron in the room. Vanessa gasped, her face turning a ghostly shade of pale, but her survival instinct for blame kicked in before she could even apologize. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. She screamed that it was my fault, claiming that my heavy boots had bumped the table and caused her to lose her balance. It was a blatant lie, a desperate attempt to shift the embarrassment onto the family scapegoat. Terrence was trembling with rage, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he looked down at the ruined remains of his expensive wardrobe. He barked at me to do something, his voice echoing with the entitlement of a man who thought the world owed him everything. My father Otis did not hesitate for a single second to join the assault. He slammed his hand onto the table, making the silverware rattle like dry bones. He looked at me with a coldness that would have broken a weaker woman. He told me that I was a clumsy embarrassment and that I had ruined a beautiful family moment with my presence. He then pointed a trembling finger at the floor, right at Terrence's stained leather shoes. He told me that since I was already dressed like a servant, I should act like one. He commanded me to get on my knees and use my cloth napkin to scrub the wine out of Terrence's shirt and shoes. He said that a humble spirit was the only thing that would save my soul, and that I should start by serving my betters right here in front of God and everyone. I looked at my father, and for the first time in 45 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, just a profound sense of clarity. I told him that my soul was already saved, and that I did not take orders from men who mistook cruelty for holiness. I told Terrence that a man who valued a shirt more than his sister was not a man at all. The silence at the table was deafening, but it was broken by the sound of firm, polished footsteps approaching from the shadows of the dining room. It was Mr. Henderson, the general manager of Soul and Vine. He was an elegant man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Terrence's entire car. Terrence turned to him, his face lighting up with a wicked expectation. He told Mr. Henderson that I was a vagrant who had assaulted him and demanded that I be thrown out into the street immediately. He even suggested that the restaurant should call the police to report a disturbance. Vanessa nodded eagerly, adding that I was a threat to the refined atmosphere of the establishment. Mr. Henderson did not even glance at Terrence. He stepped past the ruined shirt and the spilled wine, stopping exactly 2 feet in front of me. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head in a gesture of deep, quiet reverence. He spoke in a voice that was calm, but carried to every ear at the table. He welcomed me back and called me Miss King, apologizing profusely that my evening had been interrupted by such uncivilized behavior. He asked if I would like him to clear the table or if I preferred to move to the private mahogany suite on the top floor. The look on my father's face was one of pure, unadulterated confusion. Vanessa's mouth hung open, her lipstick smudged and her arrogance momentarily paralyzed. Terrence began to stammer, his finger still pointed at me, but his confidence withering like a vine in the frost. They were trapped in a reality they could not comprehend. To them, I was the help, but to the man who ran the most exclusive house in the city, I was the only person in the room who truly mattered. I took a slow sip of my water, watching the dawn of realization struggle to break through their thick clouds of pride. The silence that followed the spill was sharp and jagged, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of $5,000 wine onto the marble floor. Vanessa stood there, her hands trembling, and her face twisting into a mask of pure, calculated deception. Before the first drop had even dried on Terrence's shirt, she turned her gaze toward me with a ferocity that was meant to kill. She screamed my name, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that cut through the smooth jazz playing in the background. She demanded to know what on earth was wrong with me. She accused me of being so consumed by jealousy that I had intentionally reached across the table to sabotage their happiness. She shouted that I could not stand to see her husband succeed and that I had ruined his expensive designer clothes because I was bitter about my own miserable life on that farm. Every word out of her mouth was a poisonous lie designed to deflect the embarrassment of her own clumsiness. She told the entire restaurant that I was a hateful woman who lived to drag others down into the dirt with me. Terrence joined in, his voice shaking with a pathetic, infantile rage. He called me a saboteur and a parasite, claiming that I had destroyed a shirt that cost more than I made in 3 months of manual labor. The accusations felt like physical blows, but I sat there with my hands resting quietly on the table, watching the performance with a detached sort of pity. They needed me to be the villain so they could continue to believe they were the heroes of their own shallow story. Vanessa's eyes were wide and frantic, searching for any sign of weakness in my expression, but she found nothing but a calm, steady wall of truth. She continued to rant, telling my father that I should be banished from the family for good because I was a danger to their reputation and their peace. To her, the truth was something to be manipulated and discarded, while to me, the truth was the only thing keeping me in that chair. My father did not ask for my side of the story. He did not look for the wet ring on Vanessa's sleeve or the way her phone was still clutched in her hand. He chose to believe the lie because it fit his narrative of my failure. He looked at me with a disappointment that was so heavy it felt like a physical weight in the room. He told me that my envy was a sin that would eventually consume me. He said that by ruining Terrence's shirt, I had proven that I was not worthy of the Washington name. The cruelty in the room was suffocating, a toxic cloud of ego and vanity that made the air feel thin. But even as they shouted and pointed their fingers, I knew that their words were just empty noise. They were fighting a war they had already lost, and their desperate lies were the only weapons they had left. The tension at the table reached a breaking point as the red wine continued to soak into the fabric of Terrence's shirt, looking like a fresh wound. My father, Otis Washington, stood up with a slow and terrifying, deliberate motion. He did not look at Vanessa, who was the true architect of this disaster, nor did he seek the truth of how the glass had actually fallen. Instead, he fixed his gaze on me with a cold and heavy authority that he usually reserved for the most wayward sinners in his congregation. He adjusted his glasses and leaned over the table, his shadow falling over me like a shroud. He spoke in a low, vibrating tone that carried the weight of a divine decree. He told me that my pride had always been my downfall, and that today my jealousy had finally manifested into a shameful act of sabotage. He did not raise his voice, which somehow made his words feel even more like sharpened blades. He told me that as a daughter of the church and a member of the Washington family, I had a moral debt to pay for the damage I had caused to my brother-in-law. He reached onto the table and grabbed a white linen napkin, snapping it through the air before dropping it in front of my muddy boots. He commanded me to get down on the floor immediately. He told me that the Lord taught us the beauty of service and the necessity of washing the feet of those we have wronged. He looked me dead in the eye and said that I must kui shung to scrub the wine stains from Terrence's designer shoes and his ruined shirt as a public act of penance. Vanessa leaned back, a small and cruel smile playing on her lips as she watched my father dismantle my dignity. Terrence puffed out his chest, looking down at me from his seat as if he were a king awaiting a servant. He moved his foot forward, presenting his stained leather shoe to me with an expectant smirk. He told me to make sure I got into the seams because that leather was more expensive than my entire life's work. My father nodded in agreement, adding that my refusal to serve would be seen as a direct rebellion against his house and the values he had raised me with. He told me to swallow my arrogance and start cleaning if I ever wanted to be welcomed at his table again. I looked at the white napkin lying in the dirt near my boots and then looked up at the man who had raised me. I saw a man who used the word of God as a leash to keep me small, a man who valued the outward appearance of a shiny shirt over the inner heart of his own child. The silence of the restaurant seemed to press in on us, 100 eyes watching to see if I would break. But as I sat there, the weight of their expectations finally snapped. I realized that you cannot serve people who only see you as a footstool. I looked my father in his eyes, feeling a strange and powerful peace wash over me, and I told him that the only person I bowed to was the Creator, and he knew exactly who was telling the truth at this table. The air in the restaurant seemed to solidify as I looked down at the white linen napkin lying like a surrender flag near my muddy boots. My father Otis stood there with his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes burning with the self-righteous fire of a man who believed his word was law. He expected me to crumble as I had done so many times in my youth, to bow my head in shame and accept the humiliation he was serving on a silver platter. Terrence shifted his foot again, nudging the napkin closer to me with a smirk that was as sharp as a razor. He was enjoying this, relishing the moment he could finally break the woman who refused to worship at his altar of vanity. Vanessa leaned in, her eyes wide, with a sick kind of excitement, waiting for the daughter of the church to fall to her knees. But the woman they saw was not the woman I was. I felt a surge of strength that did not come from anger, but from a profound and unshakable sense of self. I pushed my chair back, the sound of wood against marble, echoing like a thunderclap in the silent dining room. I stood up slowly, drawing myself to my full height until I was looking my father directly in his eyes. I did not flinch, and I did not look away. The power dynamic that had held me captive for 45 years snapped in that single moment of eye contact. I saw the flicker of surprise in his gaze, the sudden realization that his daughter was no longer a child who could be bullied into submission. I spoke in a voice that was low, steady, and filled with a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs of the surrounding tables. I told him that I had listened to his sermons for 4 decades, and I had read the same scriptures he used to justify his cruelty. I looked him dead in the soul and said that God taught us the beauty of humility, but he never demanded the chains of slavery. I told him that true service was born from love, not from the desperate ego of a man who needed to see his own child humiliated to feel powerful. I told him that I would not be Kwai-Soong today, not for Terrence, not for a stained shirt, and not for a father who had forgotten what it meant to be a protector. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Vanessa's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of genuine shock. Terrence pulled his foot back as if he had been burned, his face flushing a deep and ugly shade of red. My father's hand trembled on the edge of the table, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a scripture to throw back at me, but for the first time in his life, he found no words. I stood there rooted like an ancient oak, realizing that once you stop being afraid of their judgment, they lose every bit of power they ever had over you. I was not a servant, and I was not a failure. I was a queen standing in her own palace, and the reign of their disrespect was officially over. The air at the table was thick with a toxic mix of arrogance and self-righteousness as Terrence waited for me to break. But the silence was soon interrupted by the rhythmic and steady sound of polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. I did not need to turn around to know who was approaching. I could sense the presence of Mr. Henderson, the general manager of Soul and Vine. He was a tall and distinguished black man in his late 60s, a man whose dignity was woven into every fiber of his charcoal gray wool suit. He carried himself with the grace of a statesman and the sharp eye of a veteran who saw everything in his dining room but judged very little. Terrence saw him coming, and his face lit up with a wicked and predatory excitement. He leaned back in his chair, straightening his wine-stained tie as if he were preparing to receive a high-ranking officer. He looked at my father and Vanessa with a triumphant glint in his eyes, clearly believing that the heavy hand of authority had finally arrived to remove the blemish from their table. Terrence cleared his throat and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at my muddy boots. He called out to Mr. Henderson, demanding that he take immediate action. He told the manager that I was a vagrant who had snuck into the establishment to harass his family, and that my very presence was an insult to the paying guests. He barked that I should be escorted out through the back alley where the trash was kept. Vanessa nodded her head in frantic agreement, adding that I had ruined her husband's expensive shirt and that I was making the other patrons uncomfortable with my earthy scent. My father remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of cold approval. He was ready to watch his own daughter be humiliated in public because it satisfied his need for order and status. They all watched Mr. Henderson, expecting him to grab me by the arm or call for security. They were so blinded by their own vanity that they did not notice the way Mr. Henderson's eyes softened the moment he saw me. Mr. Henderson ignored Terrence entirely. He stepped past the pointing finger and the angry demands as if they were nothing more than a mild breeze. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me and placed his right hand over his heart, a gesture of profound and genuine respect. He bowed his head low, showing a level of reverence that made the surrounding tables fall into a sudden and absolute hush. He spoke in a voice that was deep resonant and carried the weight of absolute truth. He welcomed me back and called me Miss King. He told me that it was an honor to have me in the house this evening. He looked at the spilled wine and the chaos at the table with a brief flash of disdain before turning back to me with a calm smile. He told me that he had already prepared the private mahogany suite on the top floor, just in case I desired a more quiet and refined atmosphere. He asked if I would like him to have the kitchen prepare my favorite off-menu selection, or if I preferred to have these guests removed so that I could enjoy my sanctuary in peace. The silence that followed his words was more powerful than any shout. Terrence's mouth hung open, as if his jaw had been unhinged. Vanessa's phone slipped from her hand, landing with a soft thud on the velvet carpet. My father looked as if he had seen a ghost, his face turning a pale shade of gray as the reality of the situation began to crush his fragile world of illusions. The shock on their faces should have been enough to silence them, but the human mind is a strange thing when it is drowning in its own prejudice. Instead of accepting the obvious truth standing right in front of them, my family began to weave a new web of lies to protect their fragile egos. Vanessa leaned over toward my father, her eyes darting between me and Mr. Henderson with a look of pure, calculated malice. She did not whisper softly enough to hide her words. She told my father that there was no way a woman like me, a woman who spent her days digging in the dirt, could earn the respect of a man like the general manager through honest means. She suggested with a sharp and ugly giggle that I must be the secret mistress of this old man. She claimed that my dirty boots and ragged clothes were just a role I played to satisfy some twisted fantasy of his. Terrence took the bait instantly, his bruised ego looking for any way to reclaim the high ground. He let out a dry and dirty laugh that sounded like gravel grinding together. He adjusted his wine-stained shirt and told the table that it all made sense now. He claimed that the only reason a high-end establishment like Soul and Vine would tolerate a farmhand was because the manager was kept happy behind closed doors. He called me a gold digger who had traded the little dignity I had left for a few free favors and a polite greeting. He looked at Mr. Henderson with a disgusting sort of knowing wink, as if they shared a secret understanding of how the world worked. To Terrence, a woman could only achieve status through the shadow of a man, and he refused to believe I was capable of anything more. My father Otis did not rebuke them. He did not tell them to stop their filthy talk or defend the honor of his eldest daughter. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh of disappointment that felt more like an indictment. He looked at me with a gaze that was cold and full of shame. He told me that he had raised me better than to sell myself for the crumbs of the wealthy. He said that my soul was in more danger than he had ever imagined, and that my association with this man was a stain on the Washington family name. He believed their lies because they were easier to swallow than the reality that I had surpassed him in every way that mattered. The three of them sat there huddled together in their ignorance, laughing and whispering as if they had discovered a grand scandal. They were so convinced of their own superiority that they did not see the pity in my eyes. They were using their words to paint me as a victim of my own desperation, while they were the ones who were truly desperate. They were laughing at the woman who owned the table. They sat at the wine they drank, and the very air they used to breathe out their insults. I stood there and listened to their filth, realizing that no amount of money or success could ever clean the hearts of people who chose to see darkness where there was only light. The meal continued in a thick atmosphere of forced celebration and hidden daggers. Terrence, emboldened by his own lies and the wine he had consumed, decided to push his display of wealth to the absolute limit. He began ordering the most expensive items on the menu with a reckless disregard for the cost. He demanded 3 servings of the premium Osetra caviar and insisted that the kitchen pack 2 additional bottles of the Legacy Red for him to take home as a souvenir of his greatness. Vanessa cheered him on, her eyes gleaming with the reflected light of the crystal chandeliers as she whispered about how the other patrons must be dying of envy. When the final course was cleared, Mr. Henderson approached the table with a silver tray upon which sat a small leather-bound folder. Terrence reached for the folder with a flourish, opening it just wide enough for the light to hit the total amount. The bill had climbed to $15,340. It was a staggering sum, an amount that could have fed 100 families for a month. But Terrence did not blink. He looked at me with a smirk that was meant to be the final nail in my coffin of poverty. He pulled out a sleek, heavy black credit card from his designer wallet, holding it between 2 fingers so that everyone at the table could see the prestigious logo. He told the table that a card like this had no limit because the bank knew he was a man of infinite substance. He handed the card to Mr. Henderson and told him to keep the change as a tip for his excellent service to a real gentleman. Mr. Henderson took the card with a polite nod and walked toward the discreet terminal at the front of the restaurant. The silence at the table was heavy with expectation. Vanessa was already talking about where they would go for drinks afterward, while my father looked at Terrence with a level of pride he had never once shown me. But after a few minutes, Mr. Henderson returned, and the look on his face was no longer one of professional warmth. He held the black card in his hand and placed it back on the silver tray. He informed the table that the transaction had been declined. Terrence's face turned a shade of crimson that almost matched the wine. He barked that there must be a mistake with the machine and demanded that the manager run the card again. Mr. Henderson remained perfectly calm. He explained that he had tried the card 3 times and had even attempted to authorize the business account associated with Terrence's firm. However, the response from the bank was absolute. The accounts were not just empty, they had been officially frozen by a federal order. Terrence began to sweat the droplets rolling down his forehead and staining his already ruined collar. He pulled out a second card, then a third. his movements becoming frantic and desperate. Each one met the same fate: declined, declined, declined. The bravado he had worn all evening began to crumble like wet sand, revealing a man who was terrified of the truth he could no longer hide. The atmosphere shifted from a dinner party to a crime scene in a matter of seconds. Terrence realized that he was trapped in a room he could not pay for, surrounded by people who were beginning to realize he was a fraud. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a wild and irrational hatred. He shouted that I had done this to him. He told my father and the surrounding patrons that I was a criminal hacker who had sabotaged his bank accounts out of spite. He reached for his phone and dialed the police, screaming into the receiver that there was a thief at Soul and Vine who was trying to destroy his life. He was so far gone in his own delusion that he did not realize he was calling for his own doom. Within 10 minutes, the sound of heavy boots echoed at the entrance. 2 police officers and a man in a dark suit walked through the door. Terrence stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me, shouting that they needed to arrest me immediately for cybercrimes and theft. The officer in charge looked at the bill, then at the black card, and then at a file he held in his hand. He did not move toward me. Instead, he stepped around the table and grabbed Terrence by the arm. He told Terrence that there were no hackers here tonight, only a man who was wanted for a string of service frauds and grand larceny. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a liar finally meeting the consequence of his own making. The golden light of the dining room seemed to dim as Mr. Henderson stood motionless with the silver tray. Terrence was trembling, his fingers fumbling with his leather wallet as he pulled out a second card, this one a bright gold business account. He shoved it toward the manager, his voice cracking as he demanded that they try again. He claimed that the first card was simply having a chip error, but the terminal issued the same haunting double beep. Declined. He pulled out a third card, a personal line of credit, but the screen flashed a bright red message that stated the account was frozen by the issuing bank. Terrence looked like a man watching his house burn down. He began to sweat through his expensive blazer, the dark patches spreading under his arms, as he realized that every single one of his financial lifelines had been severed at once. The embarrassment was too much for his fragile ego to handle, and he turned his shame into a weapon of pure malice. Just as 2 uniformed officers entered the restaurant, Terrence jumped to his feet and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He began to scream at the top of his lungs, claiming that I was a dangerous cybercriminal and a professional hacker. He told the officers that I had been sitting at the table using hidden devices to freeze his accounts because I was jealous of his success and his marriage to Vanessa. He shouted that I was a bitter farmhand who wanted to humiliate a decent man in public. He demanded that they tackle me and search my pockets for the hacking tools he was certain I possessed. Vanessa joined in her voice a shrill siren as she told the police that I was a disgrace who had always hated seeing her husband achieve greatness. The police sergeant, a man named Miller, who had known me for 15 years, did not move toward me with handcuffs. Instead, he walked past Terrence and gave me a polite, knowing nod. He turned to the entire table and spoke in a booming voice that commanded the attention of every person in the restaurant. He informed the group that they were making a very grave mistake. He identified me clearly as Regina King, the sole owner of the Soul and Vine restaurant and the entire commercial building that they were currently standing in. He told Terrence that I did not need to hack his meager accounts because I possessed more wealth than he could ever imagine in 10 lifetimes. My father Otis let his fork fall onto the plate with a loud metallic clang, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he stared at me in disbelief. Sergeant Miller then turned his full attention to Terrence. He informed him that his cards were not declined because of a hacker, but because a federal warrant had been issued for his arrest. He told the table that Terrence was being charged with massive financial fraud, securities manipulation, and grand larceny involving the theft of over $4 million from his previous clients. The officers moved in quickly, grabbing Terrence by his silk-clad arms and forcing them behind his back. The sound of the metal handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the silent room like a gavel. Terrence was led away in tears, passing by several prominent members of my father's church who watched the scene with expressions of pure horror. Vanessa did not run after her husband as he was being dragged to the patrol car. Instead, she stayed seated, looking at the mountain of caviar and the expensive wine bottles that were packed to go. She began to wail and sob, but her words were not about Terrence or his prison sentence. She cried out that she had no way to pay for all the luxury items they had ordered, and that her reputation would be ruined if she was forced to wash dishes to pay the bill. I looked at my sister and my father with a cold and final detachment. I took the bill from the tray and signed my name across the bottom with a steady hand. I told them that the meal was on the house today. I said they should consider it a parting gift, a final feast for a family that was now officially broken beyond repair. The sun rose over the city with a cold and unforgiving brilliance the next morning. My father Otis had spent the entire night scrambling to save what remained of his pride. He had gone so far as to put his beloved luxury sedan up as collateral to secure a temporary bail for Terrence. He believed, or perhaps he was desperate enough to believe, that Terrence just needed one more day to finalize the massive merger. Terrence had convinced him that once the ink was dry on the deal with KR Enterprises, he would be swimming in enough cash to make the federal warrants and the fraud charges vanish like smoke. He arrived at the corporate headquarters looking haggard, his eyes bloodshot, and his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in a holding cell, but his arrogance remained perfectly intact. I was already there watching the scene unfold from the security monitors in the executive lounge. Terrence strode into the boardroom as if he were a conquering hero rather than a man on the verge of a prison sentence. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, addressing the frightened shareholders and board members. He began to outline his grand plan for what he called optimization. With a cruel and steady voice, he proposed an immediate termination of 40% of the total workforce. He focused specifically on the senior staff men and women who had given over 20 years of their lives to the company. He called these loyal employees a collection of old and heavy burdens that were dragging down the profit margins with their pension requirements. He spoke about human lives as if they were nothing more than faulty line items on a balance sheet. I watched as the older board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces reflecting a mix of fear and disgust. Terrence laughed at their hesitation, telling them that in the new world of high finance, there was no room for sentimentality or respect for the past. He was so busy celebrating his own perceived brilliance that he did not hear the heavy double doors at the end of the hall being unlatched. The moment of truth arrived exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning. I did not enter the room as the woman with muddy boots and faded jeans. I had transformed. I was wearing a charcoal gray power suit, tailored to absolute perfection, and my hair was swept back in a style that commanded instant respect. The silence that hit the room was so thick, it was almost suffocating. Terrence turned toward the door, his jaw literally dropping as his eyes struggled to process the image in front of him. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own chair, and his face turned a ghostly shade of white. He began to stammer, his voice high and frantic, asking me what on earth I was doing in a restricted area. He pointed toward this hallway and shouted that the janitorial closet was in the other direction. He told the board members to ignore me, claiming that I was just a confused relative who had lost her way. My lead assistant, a sharp and professional man named David, stepped forward and raised his hand to silence Terrence's pathetic outburst. David spoke with a voice that echoed through the high ceilings of the boardroom. He informed everyone present that they were in the presence of the majority shareholder and the newly appointed chairperson of KR Enterprises, the parent company that had successfully completed the acquisition of their firm at Sunrise. He introduced me as Miss Regina King. The air seemed to leave Terrence's lungs all at once. He collapsed back into his seat, his hands shaking as he realized that the woman he had treated like dirt was now the woman who held his entire future in the palm of her hand. I walked toward the head of the table with a steady and deliberate pace, the sound of my heels striking the floor like the ticking of a clock, counting down to 0. I did not say a word as I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in blue folders. I threw the files onto the mahogany table with a heavy thud that made the water glasses rattle. I looked Terrence directly in his hollow eyes and told him that his days of playing God with other people's lives were over. I explained to the board that while Terrence was busy planning to fire 40% of the staff to save money, he had already stolen far more than their salaries combined. I pointed to the forensic audit on page 1, which showed that Terrence had embezzled exactly $4 million from the employee pension fund over the last 24 months. He had used that money, the retirement security of honest people, to purchase a fleet of European luxury cars and the diamond jewelry that Vanessa flaunted at dinner. The room erupted into a wave of shocked whispers, but I raised my hand to silence them. I turned my gaze toward the board members and the senior employees who were standing near the walls. I declared with a voice of absolute certainty that as the new owner and chairperson, I was canceling all of Terrence's heartless proposals. I announced that not a single worker would be laid off today, especially not the veterans who had built this company with their sweat for over 20 years. I told them that this company belonged to the people who did the real work, not to the predators in expensive suits, and that I was here to protect their legacy. I looked at Terrence, who was now trembling so violently that he could barely stay in his chair, and I told him that the only person being terminated today was him. Just as the words left my lips, the heavy boardroom doors swung open for the second time. This time, it was not my staff, but a team of federal agents in dark windbreakers with the golden letters of the FBI visible on their backs. They did not hesitate. They moved toward the head of the table and informed Terrence that he was being taken into federal custody for wire fraud, money laundering, and the massive embezzlement of pension funds. The local police had only scratched the surface, but the federal government had the full picture. As they pulled him from his chair, Vanessa burst into the room, her hair disheveled and her face streaked with mascara. She began to scream about her rights and demanded justice for her husband, calling me a traitor to my own family. One of the federal agents stepped in front of her and told her to be quiet. He looked at the orange Hermes bag on her arm and the diamond-encrusted Rolex on her wrist. He informed her that under federal law, any assets purchased with stolen funds were subject to immediate seizure. Right there in front of the entire board and the staff she had once looked down upon, the agents forced her to hand over her designer bag and unstrap her luxury watch. They told her that these items were not fashion statements, but evidence of a crime. Vanessa stood there, stripped of her expensive armor, looking small and pathetic in her plain clothes. She was finally revealed for what she was, a woman who had built her identity on a foundation of theft. I watched as they were both led away, realizing that justice does not just arrive, it settles the score until the very last cent is paid. The porch light of Big Mama's house flickered as I pulled into the driveway for the final time. This house was a sacred place, filled with the memories of Sunday dinners and the sweet scent of my mother's peach cobbler. But as I stepped inside, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic and desperate energy. My father Otis was sitting in his favorite worn-out velvet armchair, his face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. Vanessa stood behind him, her eyes red from crying, looking like a hollow shell without her designer armor. The moment I crossed the threshold, my father began to shout. He demanded that I use my secret fortune to bail Terrence out of jail and hire the most expensive lawyers in the country. He screamed that I was a cold and ungrateful child for allowing my own brother-in-law to face a prison sentence. He even told me that I must repurchase all the jewelry and handbags the federal agents had seized from Vanessa because her social standing depended on it. He stood up, shaking his cane at me, and delivered what he thought was his final blow. He told me that if I did not help my family today, he would disown me completely and throw me out of this house forever. He shouted that I would never be allowed to step foot on this property again, claiming that I was no longer a Washington in his eyes. I felt a sharp pang of grief for the man he used to be, but my hand was steady as I reached into my bag. I pulled out a single sheet of official yellow paper and held it up for him to see. I told him in a quiet and firm voice that he could not kick me out of this house because the house no longer belonged to him. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. I revealed the truth that had been hidden for 6 months. I told my father that Terrence had tricked him into signing a mortgage deed on this property half a year ago. Terrence had used the house as collateral to gamble on digital currencies and had lost every single penny. The bank had already foreclosed on the home, and it was scheduled to be sold at an auction 2 months ago. I told him that I had stepped in secretly to buy the house from the bank, not to save him, but to preserve the altar of my mother's memory. I had saved the roof over his head while he was busy praising the man who had stolen it. I looked over and saw Vanessa trying to sneak my mother's old family Bible into her bag, knowing that Big Mama used to keep her emergency savings hidden between the pages. I lunged forward and snatched the holy book from her hands, telling her that she would not steal one more thing from this family. I told them both that I did not buy this house to provide a sanctuary for thieves and liars. I pointed toward the front door and told them to leave immediately. I watched as they scrambled to pack their things into a few old cardboard boxes, leaving with nothing but a few ragged clothes and their broken pride. They were forced to walk away in the same humble state they had tried to mock me for, while I stayed behind to clean the house of their shadow. 6 months had passed since the walls of vanity came crashing down. The seasons changed, and with them the harvest of justice was finally complete. Terrence was no longer wearing shiny silk suits. He was now wearing a coarse orange jumpsuit, serving a sentence of 10 years in a federal correctional institution for his crimes against the innocent. Vanessa found herself facing a bitter irony that no designer label could hide. She was forced to take a job as a dishwasher at a local fast food grease trap, spending her days scrubbing burnt pans for minimum wage. It was a poetic punishment for a woman who had spent her entire life looking down on the people who served her. My father, Otis, lived in a tiny one-bedroom government-subsidized apartment on the edge of town. He spent his long and lonely afternoons staring at a faded photograph of our family from 20 years ago, realizing too late that he had traded his soul for a reputation that was now in ruins. I stood in the lush garden of Big Mama's house, surrounded by the laughter of the senior employees I had saved from the streets. We were celebrating a banquet of gratitude, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly at home. I wore my favorite work boots and a simple linen dress, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. I was not respected because of the millions of dollars in my bank account, but because I had chosen to stand for what was right when it cost me everything. I had learned that the most powerful legacy a person can leave is not built of stone or gold, but of the kindness and integrity we show to those who have nothing. I took a deep breath of the fresh Georgia air and smiled, knowing that I was finally living a life that was as rich and honest as the soil beneath my feet.